30 days. That was the clock Donald Trump set on July the 20th, 2026, when he signed 3 presidential proclamations aimed directly at Canada. And 30 days is exactly how long Mark Carney had to either deliver a deal or watch 50% tariffs land on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods: milk, plywood, hockey sticks, beer. The clock expired at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th. And in the final week before that deadline, while cable news kept waiting for Carney to fold, something else happened instead. Canada's negotiators did not come to Washington to surrender. They came to hold the line, and they very quietly, very deliberately, refused to give Trump the one thing his entire strategy was built around: panic. If you want to understand what actually happened in the 72 hours before this deadline, and why it matters far beyond a headline about tariffs, stay with this, because the real story is not the deadline itself. It is what Carney did with the 30 days he was given. This channel breaks down exactly these kinds of high-stakes financial standoffs as they happen, so hit subscribe now before we get into it, because the next few days will tell you everything about who actually controls this negotiation. Let's go back to where this 30-day clock actually started, because the timing tells you almost as much as the substance. On July 20th, Trump invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision so old and so rarely used that no American president had applied it to impose tariffs since 1949. 3 separate proclamations, each targeting a specific grievance. Motor vehicles, because Canadian import quotas had pushed American vehicle exports north down by roughly 22%, a $5.6 billion swing in the space of a single year. Dairy, because Canada's supply management system gives the European Union more generous cheese access than it gives the United States under the existing continental trade deal. And alcohol, because Canadian provinces had pulled American liquor off government store shelves in an organized protest that began back in early 2025 and never fully reversed. Each proclamation carried the same penalty, an additional 50% duty stacked on top of whatever tariffs already applied, covering roughly 554 separate tariff lines. And by law, 30 days is the minimum notice period Section 338 requires before those duties can actually take effect. That is not a negotiating tactic Trump invented. It is baked directly into the statute itself. Sign the proclamation, start the clock, and 30 days later the tariff becomes automatic unless something changes before then. Here is what almost nobody outside trade circles fully appreciated about that 30-day window when it started. It was never really a negotiating deadline in the traditional sense. It was a legal deadline, engineered specifically so that Canada would have to make its most important decisions of the year under maximum time pressure, with the fewest possible days to build internal consensus among premiers, industry groups, and a Canadian public that has already lived through 18 months of an escalating trade war. Trump has used this exact mechanic before. He set a 30-day deadline with Carney back at the G7 summit in Kananaskis in June of 2025, and that deadline came and went without a comprehensive deal. He set an August 1st target in the summer of 2025 that also passed without resolution. Deadlines, in this administration's playbook, function less like hard stops and more like pressure valves, designed to force the other side to either move fast or absorb the consequences of not moving at all. So when this latest 30-day clock started ticking on July the 20th, the obvious question inside Ottawa was whether Carney would repeat the same pattern that had defined the last year and a half of this relationship, a public promise to negotiate hard, followed eventually by some form of partial concession once the deadline actually arrived. Instead, what happened was something noticeably different, and it is worth walking through exactly how it unfolded day by day, because the sequence itself is the story. For the first several weeks after the proclamations were signed, Carney's public posture stayed almost entirely unreadable. At the summer meeting of Canada's premiers in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, in late July, Carney repeated a line he has now used consistently for more than a year: Canada will not accept a bad deal. It sounds like a simple soundbite, but by early August, it had become something closer to a formal governing constraint, one that Carney's own negotiating team had to design their entire strategy around. Because here's the part that made this particular 30-day countdown genuinely different from the ones that came before it. This time, Canadian public opinion had hardened into measurable, specific positions that made certain concessions politically almost impossible to make, no matter how badly Ottawa wanted a deal. To understand why those numbers carried so much weight inside Carney's government, you have to understand what Canadians had already lived through by the time this particular 30-day clock started. This trade war did not begin in July of 2026. It began back on February 1st, 2025, when Trump first imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, 25% on most imports and 10% specifically on Canadian energy products, citing concerns over fentanyl trafficking across the northern border. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs of its own, an initial $30 billion worth of American goods that escalated within weeks to cover roughly $155 billion in targeted American products. Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister when that first round of tariffs landed. By March of that year, Mark Carney had taken over, elected in large part on a promise to stand up to exactly this kind of pressure from Washington. And his very first meeting with Trump at the White House set the tone for everything that followed, a cordial but visibly tense encounter where Trump raised the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, and Carney pushed back directly, on camera, in front of reporters, saying there are some places that are never for sale. Over the 18 months that followed, the relationship swung between de-escalation and fresh conflict multiple times. Canada eventually dropped the majority of its retaliatory tariffs in August of 2025 as a gesture of good faith ahead of renewed talks. The two countries agreed at the G7 summit in Kananaskis that same June to pursue a comprehensive deal within 30 days, a deadline that came and went without resolution. Trump then set an August 1st target for 2025, which also passed without an agreement, telling reporters at the time that Canada could simply be a country where there is just a tariff and not really a negotiation at all. Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and autos stayed in place throughout nearly this entire period, unaffected by any of the surrounding diplomatic back and forth, because, unlike the emergency powers tariffs, the Supreme Court would eventually strike down in February of 2026. Section 232 duties rest on a completely separate legal foundation tied to national security rather than emergency economic powers, and they have never seriously been at risk in any of the court challenges working their way through the American legal system this year. By the time Trump signed the Section 338 proclamations against Canada on July 20th, 2026, both governments had already been through more than a full year of exactly this pattern: tariff threats, partial retaliation, missed deadlines, brief thaws, and renewed escalation. That history is precisely why the polling data heading into this particular 30-day window looked the way it did. Canadians were not reacting to a single isolated threat in isolation. They were reacting to what felt, by August of 2026, like the latest chapter in a conflict that had already cost real jobs, real manufacturing output, and real government support spending on both sides of the border. That accumulated fatigue is what hardened public opinion into the specific, inflexible positions Carney's negotiators had to work around in the final days before the deadline. This is your first real rehook, because it explains why Carney's team spent the final days before the deadline pushing back against Washington, instead of racing to close a deal at any cost. Polling from Abacus data found that 69% of residents in Ontario and 72% of residents in British Columbia wanted the provincial restrictions on American alcohol kept in place, even with a 50% tariff bearing down on their own economy. A separate survey from the Angus Reid Institute found that 62% of Canadians wanted Carney to respond to the new tariffs with retaliation of his own if Trump followed through, with only 19% saying Canada should take retaliation off the table entirely, and just 7% supporting outright concessions to avoid the fight altogether. Those numbers matter enormously, because they meant Carney was negotiating with something close to a hard floor built directly into Canadian public sentiment. Put the alcohol back on shelves to appease Washington, and you hand your political opposition a ready-made narrative that you caved under pressure. Refuse to move on it, and you risk losing the broader deal altogether. That tension sat at the center of the entire negotiation. Quick pause here, because the mechanics of what was actually being negotiated behind closed doors deserve their own moment of attention. And if you're finding this breakdown useful, this is a good time to drop a like and subscribe, because the next part is where the real leverage in this standoff becomes visible. According to people familiar with the closed door talks, the framework both sides were actually working toward by the second week of August was not a single sweeping agreement resolving every outstanding grievance at once. It was something narrower and more fragile, a preliminary deal in which the United States would step back from the new 50% Section 338 tariffs, and separately reduce certain existing Section 232 tariffs already sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos, tariffs that were never part of the Section 338 fight in the first place, but had become entangled in it anyway because Canada refused to treat them as a separate conversation. Canadian officials made that position explicit in direct terms, with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer warning that Ottawa could not accept a deal that demanded concessions on alcohol and dairy without getting any corresponding movement on the Section 232 duties already squeezing Canadian steelworkers and auto workers. In plain language, the message from Canada's side was simple. If Washington is not willing to meaningfully lower the existing steel and aluminum tariffs, the provinces are not putting American alcohol back on shelves. And if the alcohol does not go back on shelves, there is no final agreement to sign. That single dynamic tells you almost everything about how this negotiation actually functioned in its final days. Two governments, each holding one piece of leverage the other one badly wanted, neither willing to move first. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette spent days literally camped out in Washington through the second week of August, running back-to-back meetings with Greer and with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. A short statement following one of those sessions, a virtual meeting that ran roughly an hour, described the discussions in careful, deliberately unemotional language, noting only that negotiating teams had taken stock of the work completed so far and that discussions were continuing. That is diplomatic language for exactly the kind of standoff described above, real movement on the details, but no resolution on the 2 or 3 issues that actually mattered most. It is also worth noting who was doing the talking on the American side. Greer, as United States Trade Representative, has led the day-to-day negotiating effort throughout this entire episode, while Lutnick's involvement as Commerce Secretary signals that Washington viewed the specific dispute as carrying weight well beyond routine tariff diplomacy. 2 senior cabinet officials spending repeated hours across multiple days on a single bilateral relationship is not the posture of an administration treating this deadline as a minor formality. It is the posture of an administration that understood, even if it would not say so publicly, that the outcome of this particular 30-day window would set a template for how future disputes under Section 338 might unfold. Whether with Canada again or with any other trading partner, Washington eventually decides to target using the same dormant legal authority. Here's the part. Almost nobody covering this story as a straightforward political showdown fully explained, and it matters because it shaped exactly how much room Carney's negotiators actually had to push back. Section 338, the 96-year-old law Trump reached for on July the 20th, was chosen specifically because it required none of the procedural steps that slow down almost every other American tariff authority. No formal investigation from the United States Trade Representative, no national security determination from the Commerce Department, no congressional vote. The president simply determines that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce, signs a proclamation, and 30 days later, the tariff becomes automatic. That speed is precisely what gave Trump the leverage to set such an aggressive timeline in the first place. But that same speed is also what left the entire legal foundation of these tariffs almost completely untested. No American president has used Section 338 to impose a tariff since 1949, and as of the deadline itself, no formal lawsuit challenging its use against Canada had actually been filed, even though multiple trade law firms expected one within days of the tariffs taking effect. Legal scholars remain genuinely divided over whether the statute even survived later trade legislation passed in 1962 and 1974, legislation some historians argue implicitly replaced Section 338's function, without ever formally repealing it. That uncertainty gave Carney's team something subtle but real to work with. Every day Canada held out for a better framework was also a day closer to a potential court challenge that could undercut Washington's entire position regardless of what happened at the negotiating table. Patience, in other words, was not just a political posture, it was also a hedge against a legal foundation that trade lawyers openly described as shaky. Here's the part that genuinely surprised people watching from the American side of the border. As late as August 12th, with the deadline just 1 week away, a White House official confirmed that Trump himself had not yet been personally briefed on the details of where the negotiation actually stood. Think about what that means for a moment. The president who set the 30-day clock in motion, whose name is attached to every proclamation and every public threat, had reportedly not yet reviewed the specific framework his own trade representative and commerce secretary had been building with Canadian counterparts for days. Any final agreement would still require Trump's personal sign-off before it became real. That detail matters because it introduces a layer of unpredictability that no amount of careful staff-level negotiation can fully control. Career negotiators on both sides can build the outline of a workable compromise, but the entire structure still has to survive contact with the president, who has, throughout this entire 18-month conflict, shown a consistent willingness to reopen settled questions with a single social media post or an unscripted comment to reporters. And that unpredictability showed up almost immediately. In the days leading directly into the deadline, Trump escalated his public language, even as his own negotiators were reportedly working toward a framework behind closed doors. He has spent much of this 18-month standoff describing the trading relationship in blunt, dismissive terms, at one point telling reporters that Canada could simply be a country with a tariff and not really a negotiation at all. He has repeated the idea that the United States does not need anything Canada has, other than what he called their friendship, while insisting Canada needs everything from the American side of the relationship. Carney, for his part, has never fully accepted that framing. In an earlier meeting at the White House, when Trump raised his now familiar suggestion that Canada could simply become the 51st state, Carney responded directly, telling reporters that there are some places that are never for sale, and that having met with what he called the owners of Canada, it was not for sale and would never be for sale. Trump's reply in that moment was equally direct. Never say never. Time will tell. That exchange, months before this particular 30-day clock even started, tells you something important about the emotional and political undercurrent running beneath every subsequent round of trade talks between these two men. This was never purely a negotiation over tariff percentages and product categories. It has consistently carried an undertone about sovereignty itself, about whether Canada is being treated as an equal trading partner or as a smaller dependent economy, expected to eventually accept terms set almost entirely in Washington. Carney has built his entire political identity around resisting that framing, and that resistance has shaped every decision his government has made throughout the standoff, right up to the final hours before the August 19th deadline. Now, here's a rehook worth sitting with, because it reframes what actually happened as the deadline arrived. On the Monday before the tariffs were scheduled to take effect, Carney and Trump spoke directly by phone. Carney's office would not release details beyond confirming the call had taken place and describing it only as a conversation about the ongoing trade negotiations. Later that same day, speaking in French at a public appearance, Carney described the state of talks as very intense and delicate, adding that Ottawa had plans in place to, in his words, cover all eventualities if the sweeping new tariffs were ultimately imposed as scheduled. Notice what that phrase does and does not say. It does not promise a deal. It does not promise capitulation. It signals preparation for either outcome, a government positioning itself to absorb the tariffs if they land, while still leaving the door open for a last-minute agreement if Washington moves. The two leaders spoke again by phone the following afternoon, Tuesday, just hours before the midnight deadline arrived. According to Carney's office, the conversation covered once again the ongoing negotiations, with no further details released publicly. Behind the scenes, according to two industry sources familiar with the discussions, the existing Section 232 auto tariffs remained the single biggest sticking point standing between the two sides. That detail is genuinely revealing, because it means that even in the final hours before a deadline that had been publicly framed around dairy, alcohol, and vehicles under Section 338 specifically, the actual unresolved dispute keeping a deal from closing had shifted toward an entirely different, older set of tariffs that predates this particular 30-day countdown altogether. LeBlanc, speaking to reporters outside the Commerce Department after one of the final rounds of meetings that week, kept his language carefully measured. "We're going to continue working," he said. "Our job is not yet done." Here's the part almost nobody covering this story from a purely political angle, fully connected together, and it explains why Carney's approach throughout this entire 30-day window looks less like stubbornness and more like calculated patience. Every day that passed without a finalized deal was also a day that gave Canada's broader diversification strategy more time to compound in the background. Throughout 2026, while this specific standoff over Section 338 played out, Canada had been simultaneously signing trade agreements with countries far outside its traditional reliance on the American market, expanding port capacity on its Pacific coast, specifically designed to move goods toward Asian buyers, and setting a formal national target to double its non-American exports over the next decade. None of that activity was capable of solving the immediate 30-day crisis sitting in front of Carney's negotiators, but all of it shaped the negotiating posture Canada could afford to take. A government with no alternative markets and no other options has to accept whatever terms get offered before a deadline. A government actively building alternatives, even slowly, can afford to let a deadline pass without folding, because the long-term cost of losing this specific fight looks smaller than it would have looked 18 months earlier. That is the real explanation for why Carney's team spent the final week before August 19th pushing on Section 232 concessions instead of simply accepting whatever partial framework would have avoided the headline of new tariffs taking effect. They were negotiating from a position that, while still genuinely under pressure, was less desperate than the position Canada occupied at the start of this trade war in early 2025. And Trump's own team seemed to sense that shift too. The framework reportedly on the table by the second week of August, one where Washington would step back from the 50% Section 338 duties and separately reduce some of the existing Section 232 tariffs, was itself an implicit acknowledgement that the maximalist version of the July 20th proclamations was not going to survive contact with a Canadian negotiating team that had spent a year and a half building leverage, specifically so it would not have to accept exactly that kind of maximalist outcome. There's also a domestic political dimension inside Canada that made a full, one-sided capitulation almost impossible for Carney to deliver, even if he had personally wanted to offer one. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province sits at the centre of Canada's auto manufacturing sector and therefore has the most to lose from unresolved Section 232 tariffs, specifically, has been publicly vocal about needing tariff relief on steel and autos as a precondition for any deal Ottawa signs, telling reporters plainly that Ontario wants a fair deal and Canadians want a fair deal, not simply the fastest deal available. Ford has spent much of this 18-month standoff positioning himself as the premier most willing to fight rather than fold. At one point, publicly urging Ottawa to match any new American tariffs dollar for dollar, rather than negotiate quietly behind closed doors. Carney has generally not taken that specific bait, preferring to keep his own retaliation options unannounced rather than lock himself into a public commitment before knowing exactly how Washington would respond. But Ford's pressure still shaped the boundaries of what Carney could plausibly agree to, because Ontario's manufacturing base represents an enormous share of the jobs and export revenue riding on however this dispute eventually resolves. Every other province carries its own specific version of that same grievance inside this broader negotiation. Quebec watching its dairy and aluminum sectors, British Columbia watching lumber and its Pacific export infrastructure, Saskatchewan and Alberta watching agriculture and energy, even though those two sectors sit largely outside the current Section 338 fight entirely. Carney's government has had to build a position durable enough to satisfy that entire patchwork of regional interests simultaneously, not just satisfy Washington. A trade consultant tracking the negotiations, Eric Miller of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, put the core dilemma bluntly. If Trump goes ahead with the tariffs as scheduled, Carney will have to do something, precisely because the political cost of doing nothing, after 18 months of promising Canadians he would not accept a bad deal, would be significant. That is the tightrope Carney has been walking for the entire final stretch of this 30-day window, unable to fully capitulate without a political cost at home, but also unable to walk away from the table entirely, without risking real economic damage to Canadian industries that depend on stable access to the American market. Here's the numbered version of exactly where this standoff has landed as the deadline itself arrives. First, the 30-day clock that started on July the 20th expired at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, the minimum legal notice period required under the statute Trump used to impose these tariffs in the first place. Second, in the days immediately before that deadline, negotiators on both sides had been working toward a narrower preliminary framework rather than a comprehensive final settlement, one trading a rollback of the new Section 338 duties for a partial reduction in older Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos. Third, the framework remained explicitly incomplete and fragile even as the clock ran out, requiring final sign-off from a president who, according to people close to the process, had not been personally briefed on its details until just days before the deadline itself. Fourth, Canadian public opinion, running as high as 72% in some provinces in favor of keeping retaliatory measures like the alcohol restrictions in place, effectively locked Carney's negotiating team into positions Washington was still pushing hard against right up to the final hours. And fifth, both leaders spoke directly by phone twice in the 48 hours before the deadline, a sign that neither side had fully given up on reaching some form of last-minute understanding, even as the clock itself continued counting down with no public confirmation of a finished deal. It is worth pausing on what actually happens on the ground if this specific fight does not resolve cleanly, because the consequences reach well past government press releases and into everyday commerce on both sides of the border. American importers of Canadian dairy inputs, lumber, plywood, and cement would face costs that, according to trade analysts tracking the Section 338 annexes, effectively double overnight once the 50% duty stacks on top of existing charges. Businesses in that position have exactly 3 choices, and none of them are painless. They can absorb the cost themselves and watch their margins shrink. They can pass the cost directly to American consumers, which is the outcome economists overwhelmingly expect, given how thin margins already run in sectors like home building and food processing. Or they can attempt to find alternative suppliers outside Canada entirely, a process that, for integrated supply chains built over decades, is neither fast nor cheap. On the Canadian side, industries tied to auto manufacturing, dairy production, and craft alcohol face a mirror image of that same pressure, reduced access to their largest single export market at exactly the moment global commodity prices and currency swings were already squeezing margins. Both economies, in other words, absorb real damage regardless of which government ultimately claims the political win. And that shared cost is part of why so many economists on both sides of the border have spent the past several weeks quietly urging both governments toward a deal rather than a prolonged standoff, even as public opinion in Canada pushed Carney toward exactly the opposite instinct. What makes this particular deadline different from the ones that came before it in this long-running standoff is not the tariff math. $20 billion, 554 tariff lines, 50% duties stacked on top of existing ones, All of that is consistent with the broader pattern of this trade war that has now run for roughly a year and a half. What is different is the posture Carney's government brought into these final 30 days. Not a rush to settle at any cost, and not a dramatic public rupture either, but something closer to disciplined patience, absorbing pressure from Washington while quietly building leverage everywhere else, and refusing to let a deadline engineered, specifically to force panic actually produce it. Whether that patience produces a genuine breakthrough in the days immediately following this deadline, or whether it simply means Canadian consumers and American importers alike start absorbing 50% tariffs on hockey sticks, cheese, and beer while negotiations continue in the background, is still being written in real time as this story is being told. What is already clear is that the 30-day ultimatum Trump set on July the 20th did not produce the outcome that kind of pressure campaign is usually designed to produce. It did not produce a quick, one-sided Canadian concession. It produced a standoff that ran the entire length of the clock, right down to phone calls exchanged hours before midnight, with both governments still negotiating the exact terms of what happens next, even as the deadline itself passed into history. That outcome carries a lesson that extends well past this one dispute over dairy quotas and liquor store shelves. Deadlines built to force panic only work when the party on the other side has no cushion, no alternative options, and no domestic political room to say no. 18 months into this trade war, Canada had spent enough of that time building exactly those things: alternative markets, public consensus around not folding, and a negotiating team willing to hold firm on Section 232, even while a separate, newer set of tariffs bore down on a hard deadline. That the pressure campaign this time produced a genuine standoff instead of a quick surrender. Whether Washington adjusts its approach the next time it reaches for a deadline like this one remains an open question, but the 30 days Canada was given to fold instead became 30 days that proved it would not. If this breakdown helped you understand what actually happened underneath the headlines this week, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is far from finished. Drop a comment below and tell us whether you think Carney's strategy of patient resistance actually pays off, or whether Canada ends up paying a steep price for refusing to fold under a deadline built specifically to force capitulation. Share this with anyone who thinks this is simply a story about beer and hockey sticks, because it is really a story about how much leverage a country can build for itself when it refuses to negotiate out of fear. Thank you for watching, and we will be tracking exactly what happens next as this deadline plays out in real time.